Welcome to Sharing Costs, Chargeback, and Showback Models. My name is Craig Morrill. I'm a senior CSM at Sumo Logic, and together with Matt Sullivan, one of our senior technical account managers, I'll be walking you through the idea of how you share costs for a Sumo Logic solution across multiple business units. And that's really what Chargeback and Showback mean. That's how you distribute costs between different business units or groups within your organization, so you're not responsible for paying for a full subscription if you're not using all of it. So what we'll do today is talk about the why chargeback and showback, why is it important, allocation methodologies and options. I've been doing chargeback and showback in different varieties for over 7 years in my previous life. So I'll walk you through the common ways that IT charges back and talk about why Sumo Logic recommends a specific approach and how it aligns really well to the reporting that Matt will transition to there at the end. Matt will walk us through dashboards and reporting within Sumo, things you can do right inside the platform so you don't have to build your own spreadsheets, your own solution to actually understand how business units are using the data inside Sumo Logic. With that, why don't we go ahead and jump in with why chargeback and why is chargeback important? So if I'm a user of Sumo Logic, part of the perspective that I have is IT services are a tax to me if I don't get charged back correctly. A direct quote, IT services shouldn't be treated as a tax to different groups. I don't want to pay for services that I don't use. Now, on the flip side, if I'm the owner of the budget and many teams are using Sumo, I may say something like this. Many teams use Sumo Logic, but I'm the one that has to pay for it all. I feel like other users are wasting my budget or treat the service as if it's free. How can I make them pay for their fair share? That means that if I'm the application team DevOps owner and I'm paying for the full subscription, but it turns out security operations is using 90% of Sumo Logic subscription, I don't want to have to pay for it all. I want that security team to pay its fair share. So really, the outcomes we're looking for as we go through this, how do I distribute costs and budgets across business units that use Sumo services? Really pay to play. And that's how SaaS should work. SaaS application should be you pay for what you use. Recover staffing costs for the team administering Sumo Logic if it is centralized. If you have a centralized team that's managing Sumo for other users, they're provisioning users, they're setting up the collectors, teams should have to pay for that. They should have to recoup some of those costs back to you. And you want to provide cost predictability to the users of the observability and security solution. They need to understand when they consume, what does it cost? And then finance. The master of budgets. They want to understand, how do I allocate these costs? How do I budget for a solution like Sumo? How do I make sure that we don't have a surprise at the end of the year and I have to pay more? So let's look at those common chargeback methods that we have available to us. The really 3 most commonly used chargeback methods within IT and just in general within organizations to distribute costs are headcount-based, budget-based, and consumption-driven. And I'll walk through each of these and the pros and cons, and then tell you Sumo Logic's recommended approach, which Matt will then show you how that would work in the system. Headcount-based. It's the easiest method that anybody can use to distribute costs in an organization. You take your total cost, you divide it by the headcount in your organization, the number of people that work for you, and then you divide and you multiply it by the headcount in a business unit that you are representing, or department. Those are interchangeable. It's easy to explain. You can say, well, I'm charging $2.50 per headcount, and you have 1,000 people. So you pay $2,500. Right? Really easy to explain, but it doesn't work well for services that not every employee uses. What I mean by that is if you're a bigger business unit, but you don't use the services, so say you have a sales division and a DevOps division. The sales division, if they're not using Sumo Logic, shouldn't have to pay for that subscription. But in this method, they would, just based on their headcount. And generally, they're going to be bigger than your DevOps organization and end up paying more for it. It'll feel like a tax for something they don't use. And then you have to explain to them. Budget-based. Costs are set at the start of the year. You know what to expect. So this could look something like, I take my Sumo Logic subscription, I estimate what I think everybody's going to use, and I split that percentage-wise. We see a lot of customers do this. It's easy to do, and even if the business changes throughout the year, everybody knows what their costs are. So I have $1 million subscription, and Matt's going to use 50% of it. I'm going to charge his department $500,000. Sounds great at the start of the year. You have a couple drawbacks as you go through. When consumption changes, you're not able to react to it. So if Matt said he was going to use 50%, but he uses 75, because Matt kind of likes to send us data, he's going to end up paying us accrue $750,000 in charges, but only pay $500,000 of it. The end of the year true up process, kind of painful when it doesn't equal the budget, because you have to go find more budget in each of these organizations. And then especially if you have mergers and acquisitions, this can be difficult to do, because now I have to take that same number and reallocate it to the divested organization, to organizations that I've kept or brought in. I've gone through that. That can take days and weeks, and you don't need more as you're reacting to that. So why don't we look at the preferred approach, right? The one that aligns really well to how you use Sumo anyway. Whether you're on our new credits model that you may have heard about, or you will hear a lot more about throughout this Illuminate, or you're on our traditional Cloudflex model, they're consumption driven. What that means is as you consume the service, you're consuming a cost. Your costs align to the consumption. With Cloudflex, you license yourself for, say, 500 gigabytes of continuous ingest. You can divide that up, and Matt will show you how you can look at who's ingesting it. With credits, it may be even simpler. You purchased a certain amount of credits. You're just burning down those credits as you go throughout the year, and each business unit is paying for the credits that they use. There's no tax to any of the business units. They're really just paying for what they use of the service. If sales doesn't use any of it, they're not going to see a charge for Sumo. Works well for SaaS consumption-based costs, like Sumo or other services you may have, like AWS. And it's easier to true up. You can say to a business unit, you overconsumed, this is your rate, this is what you have to pay. The only couple cons, and they're easy to work through, you have to have a consistent unit and unit rate, but with Sumo you have that. When you license, you get a unit of measure, gigabytes of consumption, or data points per minute in the case of metrics, and you get a rate from Sumo. So all you're doing is multiplying those two together. We do have a drawback if you do overrun. Business units may have not budgeted for those costs, but that's true in any method. If somebody overconsumes, they may not have budgeted for it. This way you can at least explain to them what they're paying for. And then you do need to build in internal costs to a rate, and that may make it look more expensive than buying direct. Sometimes what we see with the consumption approach is some business units may say, well, it looks like I can go get this from Sumo cheaper if I just do it myself. You do need to explain any other costs that you've built in for your organization. And then, hey, there's a volume discount, right? By purchasing more, we could probably get a better rate than you just going direct. So what would chargeback look like? And I'm going to use two methods for this in a consumption approach. Matt's going to show one of them and talk a little bit about the other. But first, we'll talk about Cloudflex. This is what most of you are probably familiar with, ingest-based, traditional. Each product has a unit rate for the business unit, and you track consumption by business unit. Your unit consumptions are going to be gigabytes consumed for storage, continuous, or any of the other tiers, or data points per minute in the case of metrics. And as well, if you're using our CloudSim Enterprise product, it's based on gigabytes consumed as well. So what you have is you look at their consumption of data, 1 terabyte of continuous ingest and 20,000 data points per minute. We'd be charged as 1 terabyte times their rate per gigabyte times the plus 20 times the metrics, because we charge per 1,000 data points per minute, times 30 days, because we average this over 30 days, you need to pay per day. That equals what they pay, right? Pretty self-explanatory when you get to it. It's easy math, and Matt will show you some of that in a dashboard. So even with this method, we do need to look at true-ups versus our credits method. And the reason for this is even if you're basing it on consumption with Cloudflex, you've licensed to your peak ingest, meaning if you've licensed for 500 gigabytes and you only use 400 gigabytes, you need to make up for the ingest that you didn't use when you charge somebody. And on the flip side, if you've overused consumption, you need to make sure to charge them for that as well. So either way the bill goes, you need to make sure that you true this up to what you actually consumed. That's done by determining how much difference you are from your license, and then what proportion of the ingest did that business unit use. So if that business used 20% of the ingest, and you have a true up of $5,000, then they would pay $1,000 of the true up. Aligns to how much of the platform they used and make sure that they pay for their fair share. Now, if you were over, you may do this a little differently and just look at who was over what you had estimated and charge them for it. But this is a pretty simplistic method. We will just look at one last method, which is with our Cloudflex credits. Cloudflex credits is our new licensing methodology, which assigns a unit of measure or a bank account to everything that you do, meaning that when you consume ingest, you pay in credits. When you can choose data points per minute, you consume in credits. So you've got this big bank account that you decrement, which makes it really easy for chargeback because everything just has a credit rate. I don't have to think about, is it this or is it that? And it's multiplied by the same number of ingest. So right out of the data volume index, you can do this. And Matt will show some panels. So math is unit of measure times credits, add them all up, multiply them by your credit rate, you're done. That's all you have to do for your chargeback, and that equals your charge. True up is just as simple. How many credits did I use? What proportion of credits did the business unit use? And then there you go, there's their charge. It would look very similar. If you were over, you can actually just charge them for the credits that they were over. You can look at it and say, how many extra credits did they use instead of doing a proportion, and then multiply that by the rate that you've licensed for, and that will give you your true up for that business unit. Even gives you more consumption based because each product has its own consumption. If they consume more storage, they decide to retain more, they just pay more credits. That's their option. You don't have to worry about, does that affect the unit rate? What we're going to do next is we're going to pass it over to Matt Sullivan. Matt is going to walk you through some screenshots of sample dashboards that have been built in environments and things that you could do. Matt, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Craig. Again, I'm Matt Sullivan, Technical Account Manager. I've been with Sumo for about 3 years. I've worked with many enterprise customers doing chargebacks. They're not all exactly the same, but there's a pretty common pattern and best practice, and that's what I'm going to walk you through today. So we don't really need Sumo to measure by headcount or budget, as Craig already alluded to. Really, I'm going to talk through how we measure by consumption, and there is a bit of a method to my madness in terms of the order that I'm going to go in. I'm going to start with continuous log ingest because that tends to be the biggest line item on the contract. I'll follow that up with metrics. We'll briefly touch upon analytics tiers, which many of you are using now. We'll talk about storage, and then I'll briefly touch upon the future. Okay, so it's as easy as this. All you have to do is write this query to look for view volume by team, sum gigabytes by team. Well, Craig talked about business unit, might be by business unit, might be by division. I happen to use team. All right, so this is a bit of a lie because there is no view built out of box called volume by team. This is a scheduled view, but this scheduled view is based on the data volume app. So that's what I'm going to walk you through today, is how to come up with something that is this simple to query. What you have to do under the covers to get to this point. Couple of things here too. I can run this query to come up with the number of gigabytes per team on a monthly basis. I might do that just by logging in and downloading the results. I might do that by running a search job every 30 days and emailing myself the results. Or I even have customers who are using the search job API and integrating with Sumo Logic with whatever tool they're using for the billing and chargebacks all up in the enterprise. Couple of prerequisites here. We're really one prerequisite, which is you have to have the data volume index enabled. If you don't have it enabled, go onto the administration account and check the box to enable it. Generally best practice, it's not strictly required for the work that I did here, but I would definitely install the data volume app because it gives you a lot of insight into your ingestion, measuring by collector, by source host, by source, by all different pivots. So I'd highly recommend you do that. It also measures metrics. So to actually come up with a view, as I showed, key to this is a good naming convention. I'm using source category. I have customers that use collector. Doesn't really matter. You have to have something that's measured in the data volume index, and you have to have a good naming convention on it. So in this case, I have a naming convention that starts with the environment, whether it's QA or test. The team name is in there. Who is it that we're going to do the chargeback to has to be inside of that source category if you're going to charge back to them. So then you just create a scheduled view that measures by that team name rather than the overall source category. Now, I wasn't going to bore you by going through code samples. There are code samples in the appendix, and this deck should be made available at the end of Illuminate, so you can go grab those code samples. But I will give you a little sneak peek into that code. Basically, it's subparsing the team name. Like I could do split, extract, split by slash, extract to as team, right? And I'm going to sum it by sum the gigabytes by 5-minute time slices. The reason I use 5-minute time slices is that the data volume index comes in every 5 minutes. There's no point in going more granular than that. It is also, by the way, a receipt time index. It doesn't matter what the message times were in your code or in your logs, rather. It is going to be all based on receipt time of the data. Moving on to metrics, Craig already said this, metrics are measured in data points. The data points are also exposed for metrics in the data volume index, and it's the same thing, just use a best practice. The source category will be there for you to parse out, and you can measure data points and attribute it to the team in the same mechanism. Let's talk about analytics tiers, new feature, a lot of you are using it. So rather than just having one continuous ingest partition, you may have set up your partitions in a way that has frequent and infrequent tiers. Then since you are using partitions to set up your data tiering, and since the data volume index is measuring by view as well as source category and some of those other things, the best practice again is a naming convention. So just make sure that you're naming your partitions in a way that exposes the tier type, the team name, and then whatever else is going to be in there. So then you can just count by view, parse out the team name and the tier, and then you have the same sorts of views. Special case, infrequent searching. So because infrequent data, we charge not just for the ingestion, we charge for what are called scanned bytes. In other words, how much is that data set being queried? You're going to need to somehow attribute that back to a team. Now, most enterprises are opting to charge back on the person who is making the call, not the person who did the ingestion. So what a best practice here is to go ahead and install is to enable the search audit index. And we have a new app called the Infrequent Data Tier app. Install that, and there's a ton of insight in terms of who's doing the searches and who's scanning the most bytes in the system. But more importantly, to chargebacks, you can go ahead and extract the count by user, the number of gigabytes scanned, and then with a lookup table for user to team, you can go ahead and do the chargebacks for the infrequent tier searches back to the team. All right, let's talk a little bit about storage. Storage, I find that most customers don't even bother to do chargebacks on because it's so tightly coupled to the ingestion. They just track and charge back on that. However, we do have UI that can help you manage the storage. So if you go in under administration and in the logs, you can look at the partitions, you can sort by the storage consumed and see which partitions are taking up the most room, and you can do whatever you need to do to trim it down. Additionally, it's notable that if you go to the scheduled view tab, you will see a storage consumed in there as well. If you happen to see non-zero numbers in there, you might have something to look into, because normally scheduled views, as long as you're using aggregation, don't count towards ingestion or storage. Okay, so what I just showed you was based on the current state of the product. I want to just touch a little bit on the future. Remember that this is a pre-recorded session. What I'm talking about here is a beta that should be available in October. So we're going to have a data volume index V2. V2 is going to be a metrics-based, not a log-based measurement. So you're going to run metrics queries to go ahead and do your team attributions. The good news too is that we're going to allow up to 4 custom fields to be measured. Rather than just using the internal metadata like source, category, and collector, we're going to allow you to choose which fields you measure on. So for example, if you wanted to put team as a collector or source-based field, you can assign the team during the data ingestion. Now, if you're an existing customer and you don't have a field name team set up on your collectors, as a best practice, we actually expose APIs that let you in bulk update your collectors and your sources, and that would be a good way to do it. So the other thing I should mention is that you saw that I used scheduled views for measuring, for taking our data volume app and making a much more performant and long-term stored view of the ingestion. Well, that's kind of built in when it comes to metrics, because we will automatically optimize for long-term storage and querying, so you don't need to worry about using that step. Lastly, there's going to be a new app that gives you a lot of insights, and they're metrics-based. They're using the dashboards new, and you'll get a lot of insights into your data volume. And a little sneak peek of that. This is a dashboard that happens to be showing, for somebody who is a credit-based customer, how much ingestion they're consuming. This one isn't down to the team level, but you can obviously do that as well, as long as you are sending a field name team. And all you do is plug into the dashboard the burn down rate, in other words, the number of credits that are charged per consumable. And with that, we convert the gigabytes or the DPMs, right, or the data points rather, into credits and show that visually. Thank you for attending. I hope you got something out of this. Thanks, Craig, for teeing this up. And I hope you enjoyed the rest of Illuminate, and we look forward to your questions.
Great. Thanks, Matt. And thanks, everyone, for attending. We really appreciate it. Hope that Illuminate is enlightening for you as well. And if you ever have any questions on this topic, as Matt said, feel free to ask them in the chat, or you can email us as well. We're happy to respond to any questions that you have. Enjoy your day.